The first time I saw my handwriting in a file that was older than I am, I assumed it was a coincidence. It was a municipal archive file from 1993, a stiff brown folder that still had the faint smell of mold from the old storage building they used to keep records in before the renovation. The case number was written in that old faded blue ink the city used back then. The clerk's notes were in a neat, slanted hand I recognized from other files in that year. Everything about it looked normal until I opened to the second page and saw a line of notes in the margin that looked exactly like my writing, down to the way I make a certain hooked curve on my lowercase g. The note was simple. It read, "Check box 12 before you close this. You missed something." At least that was the sense of it. I remember staring at the margin, at the steady line of ink, and feeling a strange hollow recognition pass through me. It was like catching your own reflection in a mirror you did not expect to be there. The date written next to that note was April 22, 1993. That was 6 months before I was born. I told myself it was just similarity. Handwriting is not unique the way people want to believe it is. I had seen that same argument in old forensic reports, in the margins of some case summaries. I closed the file, put it in the cart with the others, and tried to pretend that the small tight ache in my chest was just the result of breathing dust too long. At that time, I had been working in the city archives for almost a year. It was not a glamorous job. People who heard the word archive seemed to picture something grand and dramatic. Secret basements, classified files, strange artifacts sealed away in boxes stamped with red warnings. The truth was much duller. We stored contracts, building permits, tax records, personnel files, and the thick, sad clutter of small bureaucratic disputes that no one remembered until they suddenly mattered again. The archive itself was in the basement of the Municipal Services Building, a late 70s rectangle of poured concrete and narrow windows. The public entered through the first floor for City Hall and billing. Below that were 2 levels most people never saw. The first sublevel held old planning documents, sewer maps, and disaster plans. The second, where I worked, was narrower and colder, with low ceilings and long aisles of shelves under buzzing fluorescent lights. The air smelled of cardboard, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of the climate control system. My official title was records technician. Unofficially, I thought of myself as a kind of gravekeeper for dead paperwork. People came down once in a while. Lawyers looking for old contracts, city staff searching for past resolutions, members of the public chasing some small but vital reference for a family dispute. Most of the time, though, I was alone among boxes and binders, listening to the hum of the air system and the occasional creak of the building settling overhead. It was a quiet life and I liked it. I had not gone looking for anything strange. I had certainly not gone looking for myself in the margins of an old missing person case file. That is what the folder was when I finally processed what I was looking at. Case file, missing person. Subject: a graduate student named Laura Myers who had been working with the planning department on her thesis. She had done some research in the archives according to the form. She had been last seen near the building in May of 1993 and never turned up again. The file was thin. A summary of the initial report, notice of a police investigation, a few memos between the city and the police department offering access to records. Nothing else. My supposed note was on the initial intake form, as if I had been reminding myself to recheck some box of evidence from the case. Except there was no box 12 on the shelf where the related material should have been. I knew that because the work order I had been filling that day had nothing to do with missing persons at all. A law firm wanted copies of some historical zoning documents. The Myers file had just happened to be filed in the same general range, so I had browsed it out of curiosity while I was down there. I slid the file back out of the cart and looked again at the date next to that margin note. April 22, 1993. Someone had written it 32 years before the day I was reading it. The city had not changed its dating format in all that time, which was why it jumped out at me. Day, month, year. Last 2 digits only. 2204. 93. My throat felt dry, and the fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, oppressive tone that seemed louder than usual. I thought back to the first handwriting sample I remembered doing in elementary school. The big line pages, the careful loops, the teacher explaining the right way to shape letters. I tried to imagine somehow impossibly that my hand had traveled backward into this file and written this line. The thought was absurd, and yet I could not shake the sense of recognition. The G, the way the letters leaned slightly to the right, the pressure in the strokes. I had seen my own notes on hundreds of pull slips and post-it reminders in the archive, and this looked like all of them, just older and a little more deliberate. I carried the file back to my desk at the end of the stacks. It was a metal table with chipped paint and a computer that always felt a few seconds behind my thoughts. My heart beat a little too fast, but my hands still moved in the practiced, slow rhythm of the job. I scanned the barcode on the file into the catalog system, pulled up the digital record, and checked the access history. According to the record, no one had requested the Myers file since 2004. Before that, it had been pulled 3 times in the mid-90s for a legal review. There was no mention of my name. There was no mention of any annotations added later. The system did not track margin notes, of course. Only official revisions and scans. If someone had scribbled in the file 30 years ago, the software had no way of knowing. I opened a blank document and typed out the marginal note as it appeared, along with the date and case number. Then I minimized it and tried to focus on the zoning records the law firm actually needed. But the sense of something off, something misaligned, stayed with me the entire afternoon. It got worse when I went home, because the empty apartment made it easier to replay the shape of the letters over and over in my mind. I live alone in a 1-bedroom unit above a laundromat, 3 blocks from the archives. At night you can hear the washing machines through the floor. A steady low thrum that blends with the traffic outside. Most evenings I distract myself with noise. A documentary playing in the background, a podcast, anything with a calm voice explaining something mundane. That night, no matter what I put on, my thoughts kept circling back to that one brown folder in the basement. I even dug out an old notebook and wrote the same sentence down just to compare. Check box 12 before you close this. You missed something. Then I stared at the 2 samples and tried to decide if the resemblance was really that strong, or if I was just bending perception to fit my unease. It was hard to be sure. I could see subtle differences, things that could simply be the difference between pens used decades apart. The pressure of the strokes in the old file was lighter, probably because the pen was running out of ink. But the shapes, the slant, the spacing, they matched. I should have let it go. If I had simply chalked it up to coincidence, I might have been able to go back to treating the archives as just another quiet job. Instead, the next day I started digging. We have a rule in the archives. Never alter original documents without logging it. Never remove anything permanently. Never add anything that cannot be traced. I had every intention of following that rule. What I did felt more like investigation than interference. I photocopied the page with the margin note, logged the copy in my own working binder, and put the original file back exactly where it belonged on the shelf. Then, when my assigned tasks for the morning were done, I searched for the missing box 12. The city storage system is not as orderly as people imagine. Over decades, records move from room to room, from one cataloging method to another. Labels fall off. Boxes get misplaced. Some sections are carefully arranged by department and year. Others are a patchwork of whatever fit where there was space. The call number on the missing person file included a reference to evidence storage, but that storage had been consolidated twice since 1993. I went through the old location index, then the spreadsheets created during the consolidation 10 years ago. Box 12 appeared on an inventory list, but with no current location. It had held personal effects and related materials, supposedly from the missing person case. A notebook, according to the brief description. Some photographs. Audio cassettes. The note at the time stated that the box should be retained indefinitely pending resolution of the case. Indefinitely, in archival terms, often means until someone forgets why it mattered. The inventory sheet showed who had prepared it. An assistant named Donovan, who had retired the year before I started. I had seen his name on other records. He had a reputation in the gossip of the older staff as someone thorough to the point of obsession. The idea that his carefully recorded box 12 had simply vanished did not fit easily into that picture. While I was still puzzling over that, I noticed something else on the inventory list. A hand-corrected note in the margin, written in blue pen, next to the entry for box 12. It read, "Move to SB4, see separate log." The writing leaned slightly to the right. The G had a hooked tail. SB4 was a location code I did not recognize at first. Then it clicked. SB subbasement. 4 the aisle number. There is a part of the archives that does not show up on most of the floor plans. When they renovated the building 10 years ago, they converted an old storage area that had been used for maintenance supplies and decommissioned equipment. Instead of tearing out the existing shelving, they repurposed it for records that were considered low priority. Unindexed materials, boxes waiting for full cataloging, transferred contents from departments that no longer existed. That space had its own entrance down a narrow concrete corridor, and a heavy door that stayed locked most of the time. The first time my supervisor had led me down there, she had called it the basement's basement. She had told me not to go down alone if I could help it, not because it was dangerous in any official sense, but because the aisles were cramped, badly lit, and confusing. The old shelving was taller and less stable than the newer racks, and there were stories of people getting turned around, thinking they were in one aisle when they were really in another. In an emergency, she had said, it would be hard for someone to find you quickly. I had only been down there twice since I started. We rarely needed anything from that section, and when we did, another staff member usually went with me. But SB4 was in that maze of old shelving. If Box 12 had been moved there, it could have easily been buried under a decade of uncatalogued transfers. I remember standing in the doorway to the sub-basement that day, holding the printout of the inventory list in one hand, and feeling something like reluctance crawling under my skin. It was not fear exactly. The air coming up from the stairs was cooler, and it had that distinctive smell of long undisturbed spaces. Dust, metal, and a faint hint of something organic. I had a flashlight in my pocket. My access keycard would open the door. There was no logical reason not to go, but I hesitated long enough to notice the hesitation. In the end, I went down. The staircase was narrow and made of concrete, with a handrail on one side. The lights on the ceiling were old, long fluorescent tubes that flickered once before coming fully on. They left patches of shadow in the corners where the stairs turned. The door at the bottom opened on a short hallway with cinder block walls painted an uneven beige. Another door at the end had the old SB4 label stenciled on it in black. I swiped my access card, heard the faint click, and pushed the door open. The air inside was colder. I could hear a low, continuous noise that I eventually recognized as the building's plumbing, amplified by the enclosed space. Rows of tall metal shelves stretched away from me, packed with boxes in various stages of decay and relabeling. Some had crisp, modern stickers in our current format. Others had handwritten tags or no visible markings at all. I found the aisle marker for SB4 halfway down. The sign was crooked, hanging from one bent nail. I stepped into the aisle and began scanning the shelves. First, it was just like any other storage section. I saw boxes labeled with old department names: Civil Defense, Flood Management, Urban Renewal. There were even a few relics from the days when the building had housed a small city-run clinic. Then, halfway down the aisle on the left, I saw Box 12. The label was in blue handwritten ink, faded but legible. Box 12, Myers Case, Personal Effects. Underneath, in smaller letters, someone had written, "Do not discard." I slid the box out carefully and set it on the floor. The cardboard was soft with age, but it held. The lid was secured with brittle masking tape that peeled up in long, dry strips when I pulled it. Inside, there was a faint smell of old paper and something else, something like fabric that had absorbed chemicals long ago. On top lay a spiral-bound notebook with a lime green cover. Under that, a stack of manila envelopes, a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case, and a small bundle of photographs held together with a rubber band that had turned sticky and loose. I picked up the notebook first. The front cover had the name Laura Myers written in black marker, along with the words Thesis Research, Urban Interface Study. The edges of the pages were yellowed. When I flipped through, I saw neat columns of notes, dates, addresses, and observations about various parts of the city. The handwriting was small, tidy, and absolutely not mine. Near the back of the notebook, though, something changed. There were a few pages where the writing got hurried and messy. The dates skipped and then repeated. The content shifted from urban planning terminology to fragments of sentences that read more like personal notes. Things like, "The same man in the lobby again." No ID badge, but staff greet him by name. And hearing voices in lower level. "Believe it is recordings, but no speakers visible." On one page, near the end, there was half a paragraph that made my skin prickle. It said in wide, rushed letters, "Whoever is writing in the margins is using my notes to talk to themselves." The staff think I am doing it. They look at me like I am the one writing in future tense. I closed the notebook and put it back exactly as I had found it. My hands felt clumsy. Something about the room felt tighter, as if the air had thickened. The low hum of the plumbing grew louder, or maybe I was just more aware of it as a background presence. Next, I picked up the cassette tape. It had a handwritten label. Radio Colon 07, 06, 93 Archive. That was all. No name. I had seen an old tape deck in the corner of our workroom upstairs, used occasionally for digitizing ancient recordings. I suddenly knew that I would have to listen to this, that I would not be able to rest until I heard what was on it. For the moment, though, I put the tape back and reached for the photographs. They were small, glossy prints typical of the early 90s. The colors had faded toward a uniform yellow. Most showed ordinary scenes: streets, building facades, parking lots. Urban interface, I thought, places where the old city and new developments met. In some, there were people walking in the distance, blurred by motion or the limitations of the camera. In two of the photographs, taken in the lobby of the municipal building, there was a figure that made my heart slam against my ribs. In the background, near the security desk, there was a person in a dark jacket, head slightly turned, captured mid-step. The face was indistinct due to motion, but the general shape, the height, the way the hair fell. It looked like me. It was not a perfect likeness. The picture was too low quality for that. It could have been anyone of similar build and coloring. I tried to tell myself that, but my brain, primed by the handwriting coincidence, clamped onto the recognition and would not let go. The second photo showed the same lobby from another angle. This time the figure was closer to the camera, walking toward the bank of elevators. The face was still blurred, but the posture, the way the shoulders sloped, even the way the person carried a bag over one shoulder. It felt familiar in the way your own silhouette does when you see it unexpectedly reflected in a window. I stood there in the narrow aisle, holding those photographs, and felt an almost dizzying overlap between the present and the past. Outside, somewhere above me, cars passed on the street and people typed at computers. Down here, images and words from 32 years ago seemed to point directly at me. I put the photographs back in the box, resealed the lid as carefully as I could, and slid box 12 back onto the shelf. Then I left the subbasement as calmly as possible, even though my heartbeat would not slow. That evening, after regular hours, I came back in on my own time. I told myself it was just to satisfy my curiosity, to listen briefly to that cassette tape before deciding whether it actually mattered. The building was quieter after hours. The cleaning staff had already gone through most of the upper floors by the time I arrived, leaving behind the faint smell of disinfectant. In the workroom next to the archives, I found the tape deck and a pair of worn gray headphones. I wiped a thin layer of dust off both and plugged the deck into the outlet at my desk. Then I took the cassette out of my bag, turned it over once in my hand, and slid it into the slot. The tape hissed as it started. For a few seconds there was no discernible sound, just the soft rush of static. Then very faintly I heard music. The quality was bad, but it resembled the background music used on old local radio stations. Someone's voice came on, slightly muffled, doing what sounded like the intro to a late-night call-in show. I could make out enough to know that the topic had something to do with strange experiences in familiar places. Odd feelings of déjà vu, that kind of thing. After a minute or two, the host mentioned taking calls. There was a soft click. Then a new voice came on. It was my voice. Not a perfect match, of course. The recording quality was poor, and time does strange things to sound. But the cadence, the slight flattening of certain vowels, the way phrases rose and fell. It sounded like me. Not a younger version either. The tone was too measured. Too close to how I actually speak now. I listened as the caller explained that they worked in the city archives, that they kept finding their own handwriting in files that should not contain it, that they had seen themselves in old photographs. They described the subbasement, the cold air, the strange feeling of overlapping time. They mentioned a missing graduate student, though they did not give the name. The host laughed a little and suggested that maybe there was a more mundane explanation. The caller, my voice, insisted that there was a pattern. That the more they looked, the more there seemed to be. That they had started hearing themselves in places they had not been, reading words they had not yet written. At one point, the voice on the tape said something that made me grip the sides of the tape deck so hard my knuckles went white. They said, "It feels like I am cataloging myself from both ends at once." When the call ended, the tape kept running, but I stopped it. I sat there in the empty workroom, headphones still on, listening to the slowing hiss as the tape spools wound down. My reflection was faintly visible in the dark computer monitor in front of me. I looked pale and unfocused. The overhead lights hummed. There is a rational part of my mind that keeps trying to assert itself when I talk about what happened. It points out that recordings degrade, that voices can sound similar, that errors in labeling happen all the time. Maybe the tape had been recorded later and misdated. Maybe someone else calling themselves an archivist used the city archives in some different capacity. Maybe. But the tape was in box 12. The inventory list that referred to that box had been printed, according to its header, in 1998. The handwriting on the inventory, the note about SB4, looked like mine. The caller's voice described details about the basement layout that matched exactly to the current configuration, which had only been in place since the renovation 10 years ago. They mentioned the tape deck in the workroom, the same one I was using to listen to them. At some point, the structure of rational explanation starts to feel like an elaborate story you are telling yourself to avoid staring at the blank space in the middle. After that night, my perception of the archive shifted. The familiar aisles of boxes and binders did not feel neutral anymore. They felt like a maze I had been walking deeper into without realizing it. The hum of the climate control system took on a rhythm like breathing. The small sounds of the building, pipes knocking, distant footsteps, the elevator cables, became sharp, distinct signals instead of background noise. I started noticing little things. A post-it note stuck to the side of my monitor, written in my hand, that read, "Remember us before. Do not stay too long." I did not remember writing it. A stack of photocopies on my desk in the morning that I did not recall making, all of them related to the Myers case and the renovation plans for the building. A printout of an email chain from 15 years ago, referencing a complaint from staff about hearing voices in the subbasement and blaming it on the old ventilation system. When I checked the printer log, it showed that those pages had been printed from my account in the middle of the previous night. I do not sleepwalk. At least I have never been told I do. Before all this, I had never woken up in places I did not remember going to. But I started waking up feeling as if I had been somewhere else, as if a part of me had walked for hours while my body stayed in bed. Once I found my shoes by the door, still damp with what looked like a fine layer of dust, the kind that coats the tops of boxes in the oldest sections of the archives. I tried to talk to my supervisor in a careful, indirect way. I asked if there were any known issues with the logging system, if it was possible for print jobs and room access records to get scrambled somehow. She said that sometimes the system hiccuped, but any major problems would show up in the audit reports, and she had not seen anything unusual. She did not seem concerned, but I caught a fleeting look in her eyes when I asked about the subbasement. It was quick, gone almost as soon as it appeared. A kind of tired discomfort, like someone trying to avoid remembering something they had decided was not their problem anymore. I hinted at the fact that there were misfiled materials down there, that some boxes did not appear in the main index. She nodded and said that section was due for a thorough recataloguing, but they were understaffed. She suggested that if I had spare time after my regular work, I could start creating a more detailed inventory. So, without meaning to, I got exactly the authorization I needed to spend more time in the place that disturbed me most. I began taking a notebook with me whenever I went down to SB4. It was just a regular spiral notebook, the kind you can buy for a few dollars anywhere. I wrote down box numbers, label descriptions, and shelf locations. I sketched rough maps of the aisles, noting where signs were missing or mislabeled. First, my notes looked normal. Then slowly something changed. I would turn a page and find lists I did not remember writing in my own handwriting. Box codes that were not in any official system. Phrases that did not make sense out of context, like, "The door only opens inward when you are already inside." Or, "He told me he saw me standing behind my own shoulder." Some of the notes seemed to be directions, addressed to me in a voice that was oddly neutral. Simple statements like, "Do not look up when the pipes stop making noise." Or, "If you see yourself in the reflection of something that is not reflective, leave immediately." I had no memory of writing these notes, yet they were in my notebook in my usual style, in between pages I distinctly remembered filling out in real time. I started marking the dates next to each of these stray entries, writing the date as I understood it when I first saw the note. That is when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The dates on some of those entries were in the future. At that point, the rational part of my brain was no longer trying very hard. It would pipe up now and then with half-hearted suggestions. Maybe someone was playing a very specific, highly elaborate prank on me, but those explanations felt thinner than the paper in my notebook. The more I tried to imagine the logistics of such a prank, the more absurd it seemed. There were no cameras in SB4 beyond the doorway. Only 2 people had regular keycard access, myself and my supervisor. And there was no reason for her to go to such lengths to unsettle me, especially in a way that left no trace in the official records. I began to entertain a different possibility, not fully believing it, not in the way you believe in the weight of a box in your hands, but in a more hesitant theoretical way. The possibility that time, at least in that part of the building, did not move strictly forward. I did not phrase it that cleanly in my head at first. It was more like a feeling that the past was not entirely passed down there, that it could still be edited, annotated, threaded through with new additions that felt old the moment they appeared. I knew enough about perception and memory to recognize how dangerously close I was drifting to a place where people stopped trusting their own minds. I did small things to test myself. I wrote a note in my notebook in block letters, something I would normally never do, and left a blank space below it. Then I put the notebook in my locker and walked away, counting my steps, forcing myself not to think about it. When I came back an hour later, I opened to that page. There was a line in my regular handwriting under the block letters. It said, "This will already be written when you read it." I took a photo of the page with my phone, then checked the metadata to see the timestamp. The photo was taken at 3:17 p.m. The note itself, according to the small date I had scrawled absent-mindedly in the corner, was dated for the following week. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. You could argue that I had written the note before leaving the notebook in the locker, and somehow forgotten. That I had written it earlier that day, and the date was an error. That I was sliding into some kind of dissociative state. All of these options were uncomfortable. None of them explained why the words felt unfamiliar, like something that had been composed by a version of me that was adjacent but not identical to the one standing there in that moment. Around this time, I started having a recurring dream. In the dream, I was in the subbasement, but the shelves were taller and closer together, forming narrow corridors that rose higher than they do in reality. The lights overhead flickered, not with electricity but with something like distant lightning caught in glass tubes. There was a sound like pages turning in another room, multiplied 100 times and layered until it became a kind of soft roar. In the dream, I would be walking down an aisle, fingers brushing the sides of boxes as I passed. Some boxes were warm to the touch, some cold. Occasionally I would see my own name on a label, followed by a year that had not come yet. When I tried to open those boxes, my hands would pass through them as if they were nothing but light. Every time I looked down at myself in the dream, I would be wearing a different outfit. Clothes from my childhood, from high school, from jobs I had before the archive. Once I looked down and saw my own hands, older, the skin thinner. A faint scar on the left forearm that I do not currently have. In that version of the dream, I woke up with the sensation of having just looked in a mirror that did not match the person who climbed out of bed. One morning, after a particularly vivid version of the dream, I woke to find a sheet of paper on my kitchen table. It was a photocopy, slightly blurred at the edges. The image was of an incident report form from the archives, dated 3 years in the future. It referenced a staff member by my name who had been found in SB, for after hours, unresponsive, speaking softly as if engaged in a conversation no one else could hear. The report stated that I had been taken to a hospital for evaluation and that, pending further assessment, my access privileges had been suspended. At the bottom was a line indicating that a recommendation had been made to transfer certain materials from SB4 to secure storage at an unnamed facility. There was no official header that I recognized. The format of the form was slightly different from our current reports. It looked like a draft of a template that might someday exist. The signature at the bottom belonged to my supervisor. I did not own a photocopier. The apartment building had a small communal office downstairs with a cheap machine in it, but it required a code I did not have and it jammed constantly. I held the paper up to the light and looked for any signs of tampering. It was just paper. Ordinary, slightly rough. The black toner lines did not show any obvious signs of manipulation. I folded that sheet and carried it with me all day in my pocket, as if keeping it close would anchor me somehow. The more I tried to pull back from whatever was happening, the more it seemed to pull me in. On a rational level, I knew I could quit. Walk away from the job. Look for something else that did not involve concrete basements and shelves of aging paper. But quitting felt, in some quiet way, beside the point. It felt like abandoning a position in the middle of an unfinished sentence. Around this time I stopped sleeping well. I would lie awake listening to the washing machines below the apartment, waiting for the moment they stopped, because there was always a brief silence before the next cycle or the next spin. In that silence I would sometimes hear something else. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. A sense of a pause that extended far beyond the moment. Like standing between shelves in the subbasement when the building system shut off temporarily during a test, and realizing how much noise you had unconsciously tuned out until it was gone. I found myself drawn more often to the Myers file. I read through it multiple times, even though it was thin and mostly repeated information I already knew. The official story was simple. Laura had come to the archives to conduct research related to her thesis on urban renewal and psychological space. She had an access card signed out through the planning department. She had been seen entering the building on a Thursday, signing in at the lobby. She had not been recorded leaving. The security camera in the lobby had malfunctioned that afternoon and for several days after, according to a maintenance note. Witness statements from staff at the time were bland and vague. Some remembered seeing her that week, others did not. One person thought she had seemed distracted. Another claimed she had been very focused, always taking notes. The timeline of her movements inside the building could not be reconstructed. Access logs from that era were incomplete, partly due to the renovation that happened a decade later. The police investigation had gone nowhere. They had looked into the possibility of foul play, of course, but there were no signs of struggle, no concrete leads. Eventually, the case had gone cold, the file transferred to long-term storage. The only thing that set it apart from dozens of other missing person files in the region was its connection to the municipal building, where I now spent most of my waking hours. But Laura's notebook from Box 12 contained pieces that had never made it into the official file. References to hearing voices in corridors empty of people. A note about seeing what she described as future versions of herself reflected in the elevator doors. Phrases like, "This building is a filter, not a container." One entry, dated a few weeks before her disappearance, mentioned a person in the lobby whose description matched mine closely enough to unsettle me. Medium height, dark hair, carrying a binder with the old archives logo. She wrote that this person seemed to know their way around the building, but their badge was turned so she could not see the name. She noted that when she tried to follow, they always seemed to turn a corner just before she could catch up. In the margins of that page, in the same blue ink as before, there was another note in my handwriting. It said, "You are not following me. You are walking where I already walked." It is one thing to suspect that you might somehow be bleeding into documents from the past. It is another to see yourself responding to someone who has already disappeared. I started carrying a small digital recorder with me around the archives. It was an old model we used for oral history projects. A simple device with a red record button and a tiny display. I told myself I wanted to capture the ambient sounds of the building, to see if they matched anything described in the older notes. Maybe, if I could bring the recordings home and listen in a neutral environment, I would hear the mundane sources of what people had once described as voices. The first time I played back a recording from SB4, it was mostly boring. The hiss of air through vents, the creak of shelves, the faint thud of doors closing somewhere above. Then, about 10 minutes in, there was a subtle shift. The background has faded, replaced by a soft, layered sound that reminded me of pages turning. It grew louder, then quieter. Underneath it, so faint I had to strain to hear, there was a voice. At first, I thought it was someone speaking in another aisle, picked up by the recorder's sensitive microphone. But the words were indistinct, more like breath shaped around almost words. Only when I normalized the audio on my computer and listened with headphones did I recognize the cadence. It was me again, or someone who sounded like me. The voice seemed to be reading. Not speaking conversationally, but reading from something. I could make out occasional phrases. Aisle 4, box 19, do not close the door. It sounded like someone giving instructions in a low, calm tone. The strange thing was that I did not remember saying any of those things at the time I had been recording. I had walked quietly, occasionally jotting in my notebook. I had not spoken aloud, at least not consciously. On a later recording, taken near the junction of SB4 and the corridor back to the main basement, I heard something else. This time it was clearly my own voice at normal volume saying a phrase I recognized. It was a sentence I had written in Laura's notebook. This building is a filter, not a container. What unsettled me was not just hearing the words out of my own mouth. It was the faint echo that followed, as if the same sentence was being spoken at slightly different speeds, overlapping itself, and only one of those versions had been captured by the recorder. By then, it had been weeks since I discovered the handwriting in the missing person file. My sense of time had started to stretch in strange ways. Days felt longer, but evenings vanished in a blur. I would sit down intending to review one recording or one set of notes and find myself hours later with no clear memory of how I had passed the time in between. I began seeing small discrepancies in my surroundings. A box on a shelf that had not been there the day before, labeled in my handwriting with an unfamiliar code. A binder on my desk containing printouts of emails I had never sent, discussing security protocols and access restrictions that did not exist yet. In one of those printouts, someone with my name was listed as a consultant on an internal project to analyze anomalies in archival material. The document referenced transcripts and recordings I had never seen. It mentioned terms like temporal discontinuities and subjective chronology anomalies. It read like a report from a future version of the archives, one that had chosen to confront whatever was happening head-on, instead of quietly absorbing it into the background. I would have dismissed it as a hoax if not for the fact that the timestamp in the header placed the email 10 years in the future. And the more I thought about it, the more a disturbing pattern emerged. The photocopied incident report on my kitchen table, the handwritten notes in older files, the voice on the cassette, calling into a radio show decades earlier. All of it seemed to depict me at different points along a timeline that did not line up neatly with our calendar. It was around this time that the major shift happened. I was in SB4 near the aisle with box 12, taking yet another inventory pass. The air felt unusually still. The plumbing noise that usually underscored everything was gone, as if someone had turned off the water to the entire building. For a moment, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, the soft rustle of my clothes when I moved. I rounded a corner and saw myself standing at the far end of the aisle. There is no other way to put it. I was facing away from me, looking up at a shelf, one hand resting lightly on a box. The posture, the haircut, the shape of the shoulders. It was like looking at a mirror from behind. My first thought, irrationally, was that someone was playing a trick with a reflective surface. But there were no mirrors in that space. Only rows of boxes and the occasional bare patch of concrete wall. The other me did not turn around. They seemed absorbed in whatever they were doing. I took a slow step forward, then another, my shoes barely making a sound on the concrete floor. As I moved, the lighting seemed to shift. The fluorescent tubes overhead hummed harder, flickering once, twice. The air temperature dropped a few degrees, enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. When I was about halfway down the aisle, the other me reached up and pulled a box forward. It was labeled in my handwriting with a code I did not recognize. As they opened it, the overhead lights flickered more violently, then steadied. A faint sound reached my ears, like many people whispering in another room. The other me leaned closer to the box as if listening. Called out. Or at least I tried to. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came. The muscles in my throat moved, the air passed through but nothing emerged. It was as if the space between us was made of something thicker than air. Something that swallowed vibrations. The other me stiffened slightly, as if reacting to a sound I could not hear. They turned their head just enough that I saw the edge of their cheek, the line of their jaw. The resemblance was undeniable. Same face, but there were subtle differences. Lines at the corners of the mouth. A faint scar just above the eyebrow that I do not have. An older version of me. Our eyes did not meet. They seemed to be looking past me at some point to my left. Then the lights flickered so hard that the aisle plunged into brief darkness. When they came back on, the other me was gone. I stood there shaking, my hands clenched at my sides. The box they had been holding was still there, still open. I approached it slowly, feeling as if I were walking through water. Inside the box were sheets of paper neatly stacked. The top page was a printed transcript with my name on it. The header read, Subjective Account, Iteration 5. The date field was blank. I lifted that first page and scanned the lines. The text began. The first time I saw my handwriting in a file that was older than I am, I assumed it was a coincidence. For a moment everything tilted. The aisle, the shelves, my own body, felt like falling without moving. I flipped through the pages. The words on them matched my memories almost exactly. Moments, phrases, interpretations. The description of the Myers file, the trip to SB4, the cassette tape, the dream. The transcript seemed to cover everything that had happened to me so far, up to the moment I had walked into that aisle and seen my older self. The last page ended abruptly mid-sentence. The last full line read, I rounded a corner and saw myself standing at the far end of the aisle. Below that, the text broke into half-word fragments, letters trailing off as if someone had been interrupted while typing. The cursor line at the bottom was blank. I realized that my hands were shaking so much the paper rattled softly. I put the pages back in the box, closed the lid and stepped away. The lighting seemed to steady, the air warming fractionally as the distant hum of the building systems returned. I became aware of sound again. Water in pipes, a cart squeaking somewhere in the upper level, the faint buzz of my phone vibrating in my pocket. I checked the screen. There were no new messages. No missed calls. Only the time ticking forward in its usual indifferent way. From that point on, it became impossible to view my experience as a simple sequence of events. I had held in my hands an account of my own life written from a perspective slightly ahead of where I stood. The existence of that transcript implied that my story had been told before, or would be told again. Iteration 5, the header said, which raised questions I was not ready to face about what had happened in iterations 1 through 4. I did not take the transcript with me. Something deep in my instincts told me that removing it from that box would be crossing a boundary I did not understand. Instead, I closed the box and pushed it back on the shelf. Then I left SB4, feeling as if I were walking out of my own reflection. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to creep into my surroundings. The sign on the door to the subbasement, which had always been a plain printed SB4, was suddenly a different font with the words restricted access below it. A new camera appeared at the top of the stairs, its lens dark and unblinking. When I checked the security logs from my workstation, I saw that a new category of user had been added, observers. Their names were all redacted, replaced with black bars. I asked my supervisor about the changes. She said there had been a review of safety protocols, and that the city had decided to implement updated surveillance systems in all storage areas. She seemed relieved, as if this confirmed a recommendation she had been quietly pushing for. When I asked if observers referred to an outside agency, she shrugged and said it was just an internal classification. She did not meet my eyes when she said it. At home, the strange bleed-throughs continued. New sheets of paper appeared on my table now and then. They were printouts of documents I did not recall generating. Some were labeled Iteration 3, others Iteration 7. They contained fragmented versions of my own account, each slightly different. In one, I apparently quit my job after the first incident and moved to another city, only to find similar anomalies in a different archive. In another, I confronted my supervisor more aggressively, which resulted in a formal evaluation and a recommendation for medical leave. None of those things matched what I remembered doing. Yet the documents felt real. The letterhead changed as if reflecting small bureaucratic shifts. Names of departments I had never heard of appeared. The tone and wording of the reports varied, some neutrally detached, others faintly alarmed. It was as if I were being shown possible paths from a branching point, glimpses into what I might have done if I had made slightly different choices. Each put me in slightly different positions relative to the phenomena in the archive. Victim, investigator, collaborator, specimen. The simplest, most monstrous explanation was that the building or something in it was experimenting with me. I do not mean that in a sentient, malevolent sense. There was no sign of an agenda as simple as malice. If anything, the processes at work felt indifferent. They were focused on cataloging, sorting, observing. It was my human mind that wanted to assign motive and narrative to what might simply be a system trying to reconcile inconsistent data. Still, there was a pattern. My presence in the archive seemed to intersect with anomalies in the records. Each time I thought I was acting freely, I would later find some trace of that action already recorded, sometimes in a form that suggested it had happened in multiple ways. At some point, I stopped trying to resist and decided to participate consciously. If I was trapped in some kind of loop, I wanted to see how much room there was inside it. I went back to SB4 with a new notebook. On the inside cover, I wrote a date and a statement. This is iteration unknown. I will act as if I have agency until proven otherwise. Then I began to map the anomalies more systematically. I created diagrams of where and when strange documents appeared. I cataloged instances where my handwriting showed up in older files. I recorded the times my digital recorder captured voices that were not audible to me in the moment. I noted physical sensations, sudden chills, pressure changes, headaches. I also started leaving messages for myself in more deliberate ways. Instead of scribbling margin notes impulsively, I wrote structured entries addressed to future or past versions of me. For example, if you find this note in a file dated before 1993, check box 12 in SB4. Or, if you are reading this in an iteration where you did not listen to the cassette tape, do so now. Sometimes those notes would show up where I intended. Other times they would drift. I would find an instruction meant for my future self in a folder from the early 80s, or a warning intended for a past version of me attached to a report from 10 years in the future. The temporal organization was not neat. It felt like dropping letters into a river and hoping they washed up near where they were needed. The more I did this, the more I became aware of echoes of my own actions. I would reach for a box and have a strong impression that I had done so before, not in the vague way of simple repetition, but with a detailed memory of what I had found, even if I had never actually opened that particular box in this version of events. Occasionally, the contents would differ slightly from what I expected, as if small variations had been introduced. Once I opened a box expecting to find an old flood management plan, and instead discovered a stack of handwritten pages. The text described a scenario in which I had never discovered the Myers file at all, but had stumbled onto the anomalies through a completely different case involving traffic camera footage. The pages ended with a reference to iteration 2. In that account, the narrator, still me, still first person, had made a different set of choices. They had turned over their evidence to an outside researcher mentioned by name. I did not recognize the name, but when I later searched the city's digital directories, I found it referenced in an old roster for a short-lived department called Temporal Records Assessment. That department did not exist in our current organizational chart. The twist, the true turning point, came when I realized something I had resisted acknowledging up to that point. In all the versions of events I had seen, printed, photocopied, handwritten, there was one constant. The missing graduate student Laura Myers always disappeared. Her fate did not vary. I saw accounts where my actions changed, where my role shifted from passive witness to active investigator, but none in which she reappeared alive and well. In some iterations, her case was connected directly to the anomalies. In others, it was treated as a tragic but unrelated event. In one, she was described as a researcher working on the same phenomena long before my time, and her disappearance was implied to be a result of sinking too deeply into the archive's peculiarities. In several, she was barely mentioned at all, a footnote in a larger investigation centered on me. The more I read, the more wrong that felt. Her notebook had been careful and observant. Her entries had a clarity I recognized. She had seen patterns in the building before I ever came along. She might have understood something I still did not. If the archive, or whatever lay behind it, was using me as some kind of instrument or probe, then Laura had been the earlier instrument. And something had happened to her that had not happened to me, at least not yet. This thought lodged itself in my mind so firmly that it began to shape my choices. I stopped framing my role as an entirely passive subject and started thinking in terms of interference. Could I, within the confines of whatever loop I was in, change anything about the fixed points? I did not know when in her timeline she had vanished. The official file gave a rough window. The last confirmed sighting was in the lobby of the building. After that, she had not been seen leaving. The presence of her personal effects in box 12 suggested that at some point, someone had gathered her belongings from wherever she had last been working. One of the photocopied future documents I found, labeled Iteration 4, contained a speculative note. It said, It is possible that Laura's last movements took place in a part of the archive that is not entirely resolved in our present timeline. Her disappearance might not be in our past yet, relative to the phenomena, even if it is recorded that way. Intervention might still be possible. I do not know if I wrote that note myself or if it came from another version of me. The handwriting was mine, but that meant little by then. What mattered was the idea. If time in SB4 and related areas was flexible, then events associated with that space might be similarly fluid. Recorded as past but still happening in some sense. That thought is difficult to express clearly. It felt and still feels more like a spatial analogy than a temporal one. As if certain corridors in the building connect not only different rooms but different years, and stepping into them puts you alongside events that in ordinary time would be long over. I began to look for traces of Laura that felt recent. Not just in the official records but in the environment. A pen left on a shelf, a particular pattern of sticky notes on a wall. In older sections of the building, I found impressions that felt like the residue of her movements. A certain way of underlining phrases in planning reports. A habit of drawing small maps in page margins. One evening, long after official hours, I was in the stairwell between the basement and sub-basement, listening to the building. The lights were dimmed for energy savings. Shadows pooled in the corners. The air was cool. I stood there with my hand on the metal railing, feeling the faint vibrations of water moving through pipes somewhere deep in the walls. I had the recorder running. I was not saying anything. I had stopped trying to describe things aloud. Language seemed inadequate, and I had grown tired of hearing my own voice echo back at me from different times. Instead, I focused on listening to the silences. After a long stretch of nothing but the soft hiss of the recorder itself, I heard footsteps above me. Slow, measured, descending the stairs. They did not sound like my own. The rhythm was slightly different. A pause between each step, as if the person were carrying something carefully. I stepped back against the wall more out of instinct than fear. The footsteps drew nearer. I expected to see someone, one of the cleaning staff perhaps, or my supervisor. But when I looked up the stairwell, there was no one. The sound continued, passing the level where I stood, moving downward. It was as if an invisible person were walking right by me. I felt a small change in air pressure as the phantom steps descended. A faint scent drifted past me. Dust, paper, and something like the tang of old photochemicals. I thought of the photographs in box 12. The cassette tape. The care with which someone had gathered those items. Without fully deciding to, I followed the sound. My feet landed in the gaps between the echoes of the other steps. An awkward counter-rhythm. The stairwell felt longer than usual, as if more steps had been inserted between landings. The lighting grew dimmer. The walls seemed to press closer. By the time I reached the bottom, the footsteps had stopped. The door to SB4 stood closed. For a moment I hesitated, listening. There was no hum of the building's systems. Only my own breathing. I swiped my access card and pushed the door open. The aisles beyond were dark, lit only by the emergency strips near the floor. They cast a greenish glow that made the metal shelving look like ribs. I heard the faint rustle of paper somewhere ahead, followed by a soft, deliberate thud, like a box being set down. I moved forward slowly. The air felt thick, like walking underwater. The emergency lights seemed to flicker without changing their brightness. I turned a corner and saw a figure at the far end of the aisle. Not my older self this time, but someone shorter with hair pulled back, wearing a light-colored sweater. They were bent over a box, arranging items inside. I knew before my mind fully recognized the details that I was looking at Laura. Her photograph had been in the file, of course. A standard ID photo, face turned slightly toward the camera, neutral expression. The person in front of me was not posed like that. They were in motion, intent on their task. But the facial features, when she glanced up briefly, matched. The set of the mouth, the line of the nose. She did not look at me the way my older self had, not past me or through me. Her eyes swept across where I stood without any sign of recognition, as if I were not there at all. Then she returned to her work, placing the notebook and photographs and cassette tape into the box I recognized as box 12. From my perspective, this was the past being enacted in front of me. The moment her personal effects were collected and stored. But the sense of time was strange. Every movement she made felt both immediate and long over. I tried to speak. Again, no sound came out. My throat moved, my lungs pushed air, but the space between us absorbed it. I realized, with a kind of dull acceptance, that I was not meant to interact with her. I was an observer in that moment, nothing more. When she closed the box and wrote the label, I saw her handwriting. It was neat, slightly slanted, not like mine. When she added the smaller note underneath, "Do not discard," it was in the same hand. There were no anomalous margin notes on her page yet. Those would come later from me. She lifted the box with both hands and turned, walking straight down the aisle toward the spot where I stood. For a second I thought she might collide with me. Instead she passed through, or I passed through her. It is hard to describe. There was a brief sensation of cold, a tingling on my skin, a smell of old coffee and ink. Then she was behind me, walking toward where the shelves blurred into darkness. I turned to watch her go. With each step she seemed to fade. Not in a dramatic way. No sudden vanishing. Instead she became less distinct, like a figure walking into heavy fog. The emergency lights flickered again, and when they steadied, she was gone. The box remained. It sat on a shelf that, in my present, always held box 12. The label was still drying, the ink glistening slightly in the dim greenish light. I understood then that I had been present, in some iterations or another, at the moment her personal effects were boxed up. Maybe not always in exactly this way, but close enough. My margin notes in her notebook, my handwriting on inventory lists, my presence in the background of old photographs. All of it was part of a pattern in which the building drew us into each other's timelines. I also understood that whatever had ultimately happened to her lay somewhere beyond that moment. The act of boxing up her effects did not coincide with her vanishing. It followed it. In my own time, her disappearance was already recorded as unresolved. I left SB for that night feeling less like a victim and more like a component in a machine I could not see the whole of. It did not make me feel better. Just different. Back in my apartment, I found a new sheet of paper on the kitchen table. This one was not a photocopy of an official form. It was a printout of text formatted like a narrative. The title line, in plain black font, read, "Subjective Account, Iteration 8. There was no author name. The first sentence began exactly as my previous transcript had. The first time I saw my handwriting in a file that was older than I am, I assumed it was a coincidence. I did not read the whole document. I skimmed through enough to confirm that it mirrored my experiences up to that point with unsettling precision. Then I folded it and placed it with the others in a folder I had started keeping under my bed. I realized that no matter what I did, some version of my story was being recorded. In files, in boxes, on tapes, in digital logs. Even if I refused to write another word, the building, or whatever it represented, would find a way to capture the data. You might think this would lead me to collapse in despair, to give up even the pretense of agency. In a way, it had the opposite effect. If everything was being recorded, then everything mattered, even small deviations. If the system was iterating through different versions of me, then each version had some opportunity, however constrained, to nudge the pattern. So I started making choices that did not appear in any of the documents I had seen so far. Tiny things at first. Taking a different staircase on certain days. Rearranging the order in which I processed requests. Leaving sections of my notebook blank where previous notes had shown dense writing. Then larger deviations. I stopped going to SB4 for a week, even though my logbooks from other iterations suggested that I typically went down there almost daily at this stage. I spent that week instead combing through personnel records and building plans in the main archive. I found references to the short-lived temporal records assessment department I had seen mentioned in future documents, but here it was listed as a proposed unit that had never actually been implemented. Meeting minutes showed heated discussion among administrators about whether such a department was even necessary. Most had laughed it off. In one memo, someone had scribbled in the margin, "If we hire people to look for time anomalies, they will start finding them everywhere. Better to leave that to the physicists." The handwriting was familiar. It was my supervisor's. I took this as a sign that the building, or whatever phenomenon was at work, did not require formal recognition to operate. It had been doing what it did long before any bureaucratic acknowledgement, long before I arrived, long before Laura. At some point, another realization dawned on me, and this was perhaps the most unsettling of all. In all the accounts I had found, in all the iterations, I had never seen any version of my story where I completely escaped the archive's influence. Even in the narratives where I quit and moved away, anomalous documents and experiences followed me. Boxes from other facilities arrived with my handwriting on them. Recordings captured my voice in places I had never been. That suggested that the building was not the only locus. That I, or some pattern associated with me, carried the phenomena with me. Or that I was simply one node in a network of such loci, and the archive was where my particular node happened to manifest most clearly. I began to pay attention to smaller anomalies outside of work. Receipts from stores with timestamps that did not match my memory of when I had been there. Messages on my phone that appeared and disappeared. Half-written texts to people I had not spoken to in years. Once I found a library book on my shelf that I did not remember borrowing. It was about the psychology of time perception. The due date slip inside showed a return date 3 months in the past. When I checked my library account online, there was no record of it. The world itself started to feel less fixed. Yet people around me carried on as usual. My neighbors complained about laundry schedules. My supervisor worried about budget cuts. No one else seemed to notice anything strange. It is possible that they did notice and chose, consciously or unconsciously, to ignore it. The mind is good at discarding data that does not fit its model. Where does that leave me now? Sitting here, in my apartment above the laundromat, with a folder of documents under my bed and a stack of notebooks on my desk. The building across the street glows faintly in the night, its windows like blank squares. The municipal building is a few blocks away, a darker silhouette against the sky. In my mind, I can trace the exact layout of the basement, the turn of the stairs, the aisles of SB4. I know where box 12 sits, how far down the shelf my transcript box is, the way the emergency lights flicker just before the plumbing noise stops. I do not know what iteration this is. The documents I have suggest at least 8, possibly more. They do not form a neat sequence. Some contradict others. It is possible that they represent branching paths instead of cycles. It is possible that I am not the only me, that several versions of me exist in parallel, each walking through a slightly different arrangement of boxes and margins. What I do know is that the act of telling this, of shaping it into a sequence of sentences, is itself part of the process. Somewhere, in some box, there is a transcript of what I am thinking right now. Perhaps it is the one I saw in SB4. Perhaps it is another labeled with a higher iteration number. Perhaps in that version I came to different conclusions, framed things with different words. The temptation is strong to hunt down every last reference to myself in the archives, to try to compile a master file that encompasses all versions. But I suspect that such a file would always be incomplete. The system seems to resist closure. Every time a narrative gets close to a conclusion, a new variation appears. Laura remains missing in all of them. That is the fixed point I cannot move. Maybe someone else in some other branch of this strange network finds a way to reach her. Maybe she has become something like what I am becoming. A pattern woven through records and stairwells, glimpsed out of the corner of the eye in the background of photographs. Sometimes, when I am alone in the stacks, I feel a presence that is not just my own echo. A sense of someone else moving along a nearby aisle, fingers trailing along box edges. Not a malevolent presence. Not a comforting one either. Just another observer. I have stopped trying to decide whether the archive is haunted or whether it is simply a place where the usual rules for time and identity are looser. Haunted implies something external intruding into the familiar. What I experience feels more like the familiar itself revealing layers that are usually hidden. If there is a question that still gnaws at me, it is this. Am I the subject of the experiment, or am I, in some unrecognized way, part of the apparatus? When I write notes in margins, when I leave recordings, when I describe my own experience as meticulously as any archivist, I am feeding the system. I am generating more material for boxes and files. I cannot help it. It is how I am trained to engage with the world. To record, to catalog, to contextualize. Perhaps that is why it chose me, if choosing is even the right word. Perhaps people like me are good at wearing grooves into time with our careful, repetitive documentation. Perhaps every archive, everywhere, is haunted in this way, and most people simply never notice because they are not looking for themselves in old handwriting. There are times when I think about walking away. Not just quitting, but leaving the city entirely. Choosing a place with no basements, no shelves of aging paper. But then I imagine arriving somewhere else and finding a box waiting for me, labeled with my name and a year that has not happened yet. I imagine opening it and finding a transcript that begins exactly as this account does. The thought does not terrify me as much as it should. Feels inevitable. So instead I stay. I go to work. I walk among the shelves. I listen to the building breathe. I make notes in my notebook, sometimes for myself, sometimes for other versions of me I will never meet. I check box 12 now and then, not because I expect it to change, but because the presence of those items comforts me in a strange way. They are evidence that someone else has been through this labyrinth. When the washing machines downstairs pause between cycles at night, there is a brief interval of deep, clean silence. In that silence, I sometimes hear the faint sound of pages turning, far away and very close at the same time. It is not a sinister sound. It is the sound of something continuing, of records being made, of narratives branching. I do not know if this account will make any difference. It might end up in a box in SB4, labeled with a code I do not recognize yet. It might be one more iteration among many. It might be the last. I have no way of knowing. All I can do is set down the sequence as I remember it, knowing that somewhere, in some other corner of this strange archive that includes both concrete basements and whatever lies behind them, another version of me is doing the same, or has already done it, or will do it soon. If there is an answer here, it is buried in the pattern formed by all those overlapping accounts. I do not expect to be the one to see it clearly. My role, as far as I can tell, is to be the witness and the record at the same time. So I keep walking the aisles. I keep listening to the hum of the building. I keep noticing the small ways in which my handwriting appears where it should not. I keep feeling in the quiet moments that I am being read as much as I am reading. And somewhere, beyond the reach of my ordinary senses, in a narrow corridor where the shelves are higher than they should be and the lights flicker with distant lightning, I think Laura is walking too. Her hands brushing the edges of boxes, her steps overlapping with mine in ways I will never fully understand.